Hi, and welcome to the January 2023 Microsoft licensing update from the version 1 software asset management team. Happy New Year, everybody. How are you all doing today?
Very good, thank you.
Great,
Happy New Year,
thanks,
Carl.
Carl.
How are you?
Good, good. So back again to talk about the Microsoft licensing updates for the month of January. I've had a quick look through the updates myself, and I guess well, we always say this. There's nothing too meaty in here this month, right? But I guess being January, it's probably a quiet month traditionally for Microsoft licensing updates versus some of the major updates we saw towards the tail end of last year. So Richard, I know you've an interest in all things privacy and security related. I did see a couple of updates on Defender for Endpoint, and I believe some new terminology around the EU data boundary services piece from Microsoft. So yeah, what did that look like? Maybe you want to give us some insights on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carl. I guess the first is we want to touch on is the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. It's pretty straightforward here from Microsoft. They're essentially saying customers may use Defender products on all devices and clouds. As you're aware, eligible licensed users may use Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on up to 5 concurrent devices. And irrespective of the outsourcing software management clause, customers may also use Defender for Endpoints with user desktops running on Microsoft Azure, its own devices, or devices under the day-to-day management and control of third parties. So there are no limitations essentially to using Defender for Endpoints. On the EU data boundary services, this is a bit more chunky and probably a bit more important to kind of keep aware of. So Microsoft added language to the privacy and security terms that describe the EU data boundary services. So what is EU data boundary services? Basically, it means Microsoft computers, computing environments, and physical data centers located solely within the European Union and the European Free Trade Association, which means the UK is excluded from this. The term EU data boundary services applies to online services such as your Azure, Dynamic 365, Microsoft 365, and Power Platform. This means that once the customer configures EU data boundary, any data generated within the EU data boundary is also stored within the EU. So for Azure, for example, if the service is deployed in an Azure region located within the EU data boundary, the data stays within that boundary within the European Union. For Dynamics 365 and platform, if a tenant is provisioned with a billing address in the EU or the European Free Trade Association, the data also stays within there, right? It will be in scope of the EU data boundary. For M365, if the customer provisions a tenant with a billing address, and this is important, if the billing address is within the EU or EFTA, that tenant will also be in scope of the EU data boundary, except where the customer has purchased the Microsoft 365 multi-geo capabilities, the add-on that enables customers to expand Microsoft 365 tenants' presence to multiple geographic regions or countries. All of this is encouraging to say that data that is generated within the EU stays within the EU and definitely subject to GDPR and data protection rules and regulations. However, it is important that our customers understand that this will also restrict the flow of data outside the EU data boundary. So how you configure Azure, M365, Power Platforms, and Dynamics becomes very important, especially if you're a multinational company and you want to move data in and out of the EU data boundary. So this one here is quite important and important for us to call out to our customers, Carl.
Very interesting. So quite a lot of moving parts. That one on paper it reads to be somewhat simple, but probably worth including some of the Microsoft the detail provided from Microsoft about how and when it applies, because as you pointed out there, Richard, there is quite a few moving parts to it. So in the monthly blog, we'll include some of those resources from Microsoft that will allow you to kind of dig into the weeds and have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So for those of you who know StorSimple, which was basically it utilized on-premise hardware and cloud services to deliver storage, backup, and DR, disaster recovery for data and apps. Microsoft have removed this particular offering from the product terms this month, based on the fact that it was retired the end of last month. That was a retirement that was well signposted from Microsoft. I think it was announced as far back as Q1 2020. In place, Microsoft are recommending that customers move their data to Azure File Sync. I guess, given the importance of StorSimple to some customers, I would imagine that any migration has been well planned and executed at this stage. So I would seriously doubt anybody has been left behind on this one. And I do know that from talking to customers that Microsoft had assistance programs there to help them migrate across to the alternative solutions in place. So that was the only real update that I saw on all things Azure. I did see that Windows had some updates this month as well, Niamh.
Yes, it did. Thanks, Carl. So effectively, they've just announced that, look, if you have software assurance on your Windows client OS, through kind of any of the volume licensing agreements, that if you're using kind of the Windows Enterprise semi-annual channel, then at the end, once your software assurance lapses, you're supposed to kind of remove Windows Enterprise from your devices. Now, because effectively, from my reading of it, is that because you've kind of perpetualized, and Windows Enterprise, you can buy Windows 10 Enterprise long-term servicing channel, which is the kind of the specific Windows Enterprise for those particular devices that need a much longer kind of time span between kind of applying feature kind of updates. So the long-term servicing channel, LTSC, that means that it's every 2 years that you get important updates, and that's typically for things like devices in healthcare and probably kind of retail and so on, that perform a specific function, and they don't need the constant kind of regular updates that you would with probably for users in back office and so on, like the likes of ourselves. But basically Microsoft are offering that, okay, you can install Windows Enterprise long-term servicing channel, LTSC, if you've assigned kind of a perpetual Windows Enterprise license to that device. So I was kind of reading it like, okay, they're saying that, once your kind of software assurance kind of perpetualizes on a device that has Windows Enterprise on it, it sounds like that, they're saying, well, you can install in Windows long-term servicing channel, the version that's available at the time of your software assurance lapsing. Now that sounds great, but again, I suppose it's probably, if that's the case, if that's what seems to be they're suggesting, then it would be kind of pertinent for customers to say, well, is that actually kind of appropriate? And therefore, should we really leave our software assurance lapse and continue to kind of get like the semi-annual channel kind of updates to devices, because maybe every 2 years and so on, and the LTSC may not be appropriate. So it sounds great, but probably again another one to consider, whether or not you can retain software assurance or not.
Yeah, sounds good. So William, I believe there's some interesting changes on the pricing front for Azure. Do you want to give us the update on that?
Yeah, so Microsoft announced on the 5th of January that there's a price increase to the Azure consumption charges to those customers without a pre-agreed rate for Azure. So, for example, if it's set in an enterprise agreement contract, so this price increase will apply to all Azure services and come into effect on the 1st of April 2023. and it's by geolocation or geography. So the UK has increased by 9% and the EU region by 11% on today's current rates. So whilst these percentage increases couldn't be predicted, the policy is essentially in line with Microsoft's announcement last year of their plan to review and revise geographical and local currency charges twice yearly. But what they say will be a tighter alignment with their primary currency, the US dollar. So it may not be the first change this year in prices, but it certainly will be happening on the 1st of April 2023. So it's a question of making sure that we can help customers get even closely under the bonnet of their Azure consumption, work out where savings can be realised, and try and mitigate some of the impact of this price increase.
Can I ask a question? Is that going to affect any, all customers across the board if they're currently in, what was it, the MAC agreement and so on?
Yeah, so anything without a pre-agreed rate, I suppose, is the so if you've got an enterprise agreement where it's set for its predicted rate, isn't it, until the end of that agreement? Yeah, so anything outside of that, it's across the board from what I understand.
So I suppose the top tips would probably be assess your Azure estate. If you're not doing that on a frequent basis, it's well worth looking at, right? Because we all know that the risk of waste and redundancy accumulates over time. The second thing is then, looking at the estate and trying to figure out if there's an opportunity to avail of longer term commitments, that you try and execute on that before these price increases take hold, because you're going to get bang for your buck in terms of the longer term commitment discounts that are available, but doing so at the at the lower price point right now, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose the view is that it hasn't gone up for, well, there hasn't been a across the board Azure price increase that I can remember in 10 years that's gone.
Yeah.
So in a way, it seems like quite a steep increase, but with inflation running at 10%, it sort of fits within that bracket.
And energy and so on.
If the euro or the pound sort of strengthens against the dollar in the next few months, it may be that there's a reversal of that in the next review. But it's a price increase, but it's the first one for a while, and there's things that we can do to help try and mitigate against it.
No, that sounds good. So that about wraps things up for this month's Microsoft licensing update. If you have any questions on all things Microsoft related, or for that matter, any other licensing questions related to other software vendors, please don't hesitate to contact the Software Asset Management practice here at Version 1. We would be delighted to handle any questions or queries you might have. So until next month's monthly Microsoft licensing update, we will see you then. Take care.
Bye.